They laughed when he stood between her and their fists. They called him mad, cursed, broken from the war. But when the drums started in the hills, no one was laughing anymore. A shocking revelation comes next. But before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss more stories like this, where one decision can change everything. Under the warped awnings of Red Hollow, where dust lived longer than truth and whiskey solved more disputes than law, Micah Dane walked with a limp and a far-off look, the kind that warned folk to leave him be. His coat hung in tatters, patched with bare hide and time, and his eyes, clouded but sharp, carried the weight of places most men didn't survive. Children whispered that he talked to ghosts. Grown men claimed he'd lost his mind, somewhere in the canyons, left a piece of it beside the bones of comrades now long forgotten. But on a cracked Thursday morning, when the sun was too bright for comfort and the church bell refused to ring, the town caught fire without flame. A native woman, slender and silent, was dragged through the square by 3 ranch hands, 2 drunk on power and 2 sober for mercy. Laughter echoed off the storefronts as one struck her to the ground and raised his boot, aiming not to kill, but to humiliate. That's when Micah moved. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He stepped between them like a ghost taking shape, his hunting knife low and loose in his grip, as if pulled by instinct rather than intent. The men froze, more in confusion than fear, until one sneered, "Ain't your business, Dane." But Micah just tilted his head, stared through him, and said 6 words Red Hollow would never forget. "It is now. Step back, boy." Micah brought her to the edge of town, to the cabin that leaned like a tired old man against the pines, where even the crows kept their distance. She hadn't screamed when they struck her, hadn't whimpered when they spat or cursed, just stood with blood on her lip and fire behind her eyes. Her name came later, whispered between gulps of creek water, Awanita. No last name, no tribe given, just that, soft but unshakable. Micah didn't ask more. He heated a blade to stitch the worst gash and offered her his only clean cloth, a folded strip from his late wife's apron, without explanation. She flinched once but let him work, her gaze fixed on the hills as though something lived there that spoke louder than pain. The town sent word through back channels, of course. Sheriff Gable barked from the saloon steps that this wasn't Dane's problem. Old Maureen at the store refused to sell him flour, muttering that a crazy man and a red girl only lead to death. But Micah ignored it all, sharpening tools in silence, gathering herbs, rubbing salve into cracked skin with a soldier's care. Awanita watched him, not with fear, not even with gratitude, but with the weight of someone waiting to see if he'd flinch first. She didn't speak beyond her name, but her presence filled the room, like thunder waiting on lightning. That night, as wind rattled the shutters and coyotes howled further than usual, Micah sat by the fire with his old rifle across his knees and her wrapped in a quilt beside the hearth, neither of them saying a word. Yet something passed between them, older than language, louder than protest. Something the town wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The saloon, always thick with sweat and whiskey by noon, went still the moment Micah stepped through the swinging doors with Awanita half a step behind. The piano man stopped mid-note, fingers hovering like they'd touched something cursed, and a half-dozen eyes followed her like she was a ghost dressed in buckskin. She walked with no fear, though her jaw was still bruised and her cheek bore the faint outline of a boot heel, proof of the welcome Red Hollow gave to anyone not born under its steeple. Micah moved slow, calm, like a man brushing snow off a grave, heading straight to the bar. A rancher with a silver belt buckle and hate in his mouth stood, spat a gob of tobacco at their boots, and muttered "savage lover" like it was a curse too dirty for the church, but clean enough for whiskey halls. Another called her a thief, claiming she'd wandered onto his land once, probably scouting for a war party. Micah didn't speak, didn't raise a fist or a voice. He simply turned to the second man, looked him in the eye long enough for the tension to pull taut like a bowstring, then laid $2 on the bar. "One beer," he said, "and a glass of milk." The barkeep's hands trembled, but he poured them. Awanita didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her presence, quiet and sharp, sliced through the room like cold wind through rot. They drank slowly, standing, the town watching. And when Micah tipped his hat and walked out with her still beside him, no one dared follow. Not because they feared what he'd do, but because somewhere deep in the bone of Red Hollow, a truth had shifted. He wasn't backing down, and neither was she. Preacher Malden came riding out to Micah's cabin, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, Bible tucked under one arm, and a shotgun slung across his saddle like he didn't know which carried more weight. He dismounted stiffly, boots crunching on pine needles, and didn't wait for an invitation. "You don't know what you've done," he said, voice low but shaking, like a man who's prayed too long and still hears wolves in the dark. "That girl's kin ain't the kind that forgives. The old tribes, what's left of 'em, they got drums in the hills and long memories. You shelter her, you invite their vengeance." Micah didn't answer right away. He was sitting on the porch, sharpening a blade, calm as snowfall, while Awanita watched from inside with the patience of someone who'd seen men like Malden before. "Maybe they do remember," Micah said finally, steel kissing stone. "Maybe we ought to ask what for." Malden blinked, suddenly uneasy, like the scriptures in his head didn't have answers for that question. "You think this town don't bleed?" Micah continued, standing slowly. "You think them fires out east started by lightning? You think her people just vanished because God said so?" He took a step forward, close enough to see the sweat behind Malden's collar. "You're preaching at the wrong man. I know blood. I've spilt it and seen it spilt on both sides. But what I won't do is let this town keep pretending it don't stink of the same sin it condemns." The preacher didn't respond, just turned, climbed back onto his horse with creaky limbs and a heavy conscience. He didn't say goodbye. And when he rode off, the wind carried something behind him. Not scripture, not mercy, but a low, distant rhythm, like thunder from a place the white man thought was silent, like drums remembering. They were sitting by the fire when Micah saw it. Just a flicker of movement as Awanita shifted her blanket, and the flame's light caught the ink on her shoulder, faded but clear. 3 feathers, fanned like a crow in flight. His breath hitched, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was seared into his memory like the scent of gunpowder and ash. Years ago, he'd seen that same mark on the bodies of scouts, charred, stripped, discarded in riverbeds by men who called it peacekeeping. The tribe was called the Tekana, or so the army had whispered. Said they were wiped out near Red River after a skirmish that turned into a slaughter. Said they burned their own to keep their dead from being desecrated. Said they were gone. But the mark on Awanita's shoulder said otherwise. And as she caught him staring, her hand instinctively rose to cover it. too late. Their eyes locked, and for the first time since he'd met her, Micah saw something in her gaze that wasn't pain or fear, but guarded defiance. A silent challenge. He didn't speak, just nodded once, slow and respectful, the way a man nods to the ghost of someone he helped bury. He wanted to ask questions. How she'd survived, how many of her people were left, what she remembered of that fire. But he knew the answers weren't his to demand. Not yet. Instead, he stirred the fire, handed her the last piece of cornbread, and let the silence settle like ash between them. The world had declared her people dead. But she was living proof of a lie carved into history by the victors. And Micah was starting to suspect that the drums in the hills weren't an omen. They were a memory with teeth, and Awanita was the ember left smoldering beneath it all. Micah first sees them at the edge of the tree line, small figures darting between trunks, too fast for coyotes, too quiet for game. He raises his rifle, but doesn't aim. There's no threat in the air. Just the kind of watchful stillness that animals don't hold. As he moves, the shadows follow. 3, maybe 4 children, barefoot and lean, their eyes gleaming like obsidian through the brush. They never step forward, never speak, but they're not hiding either, just watching, testing. He lowers the rifle and breaks the silence with a strip of jerky, setting it on a rock and walking away without looking back. When he returns an hour later, the jerky is gone, replaced by a single hawk feather tied with twine. No words, no footprints, just proof of eyes that see and hands that remember. Back at the cabin, he mentions it to Awanita, half expecting her to stiffen. Instead, she gives the faintest nod, as if confirming something she already knew. "They've heard," she says, voice like smoke trailing off hot coals. Micah understands. It wasn't just about her safety anymore. Her people, or what was left of them, were out there. Not ghosts, not stories, but flesh and blood with ears to the ground. The hills were listening, and Micah's gesture, shelter, cornbread, silence instead of questions, had stirred something old and patient. The town thought Awanita was alone, that whatever people she came from had burned out like brush fire. But Micah knew better now. The children in the trees weren't scared. They were scouts. And the hawk feather, that was a promise. You are not forgotten, and neither is what was done to us. The land might lie, and history might fade, but the trees never forget, and neither do the children raised beneath them. The men of Red Hollow gathered in the old feed barn just past midnight, lanterns swinging from beams like judgment itself. Their whispers thick with fear, disguised as righteousness. The preacher called it a moral necessity. The banker called it a matter of town image. The sheriff, cheeks red from shame or whiskey, no one could tell, said nothing, just scratched at his badge like it itched. Word was spreading that more natives had been spotted in the hills, and Awanita's presence, they claimed, was the fuse on a powder keg. They voted without a single dissent. By sunrise, Micah Dane was to turn her over or face jail for harboring a fugitive, though no one could say what crime she'd committed beyond surviving. The next morning, a deputy knocked on Micah's door, flanked by 2 others with rifles cradled like infants. Micah opened the door, chewing on a twig of pine, boots unlaced, eyes clear and unbothered. "You've got a choice," the deputy said. "Turn her over or come with us." Micah laughed, not a bark or snort, but something low and amused, like thunder that didn't need lightning to prove itself. "Then you better build a bigger jail," he said, stepping aside and motioning to the worn chair by the hearth. "Coffee's on." The deputies didn't enter. They weren't sure if they were dealing with madness or something holier. Awanita stood behind him, silent as always, but with the ghost of a smile on her lips. Word of Micah's defiance spread faster than wildfire. By sundown, half the town watched from porches and behind curtains, wondering who would move first. But no one did, because deep down, they remembered the war, the scouts who moved through trees like whispers, and the last time drums echoed from hills no one claimed. Micah hadn't made a threat. He'd just spoken truth. If Red Hollow wanted to punish kindness, it would have to shackle more than one man, and no cell was big enough to hold the old wounds they'd tried so hard to bury. The wind rolled off the hills in slow, heavy gusts that carried more than dust. They brought a sound older than the town itself. At first, folks thought it was thunder, distant and deep, rattling windows just enough to make a man look up from his supper. But thunder didn't come in rhythm. It didn't pulse with intention. It didn't echo through marrow like memory. Micah stepped out onto his porch and stood still as the pine beams around him, listening. One beat, then another. Slow, certain. The kind of sound you didn't question if you were born close to the land. The kind that didn't beg attention. It commanded it. Awanita stood beside him barefoot, eyes fixed on the black ridge just beyond Red Hollow's edge. She didn't speak, but her shoulders eased, and Micah swore he saw something ancient flicker behind her silence. Recognition. Maybe even relief. In town, saloon doors creaked with the shuffle of uneasy men, and lanterns swung faster on porches where mothers clutched children without knowing why. The preacher said it was a warning. The banker called it superstition. The sheriff locked his office door. But the oldest folks, the ones too stubborn or too broken to leave the land, knew better. That sound wasn't war yet. It was memory knocking. It was justice stirring in the bones of a people who didn't forget the fire, the rope, the treaties inked in lies. And Micah, for the first time since war had gutted him and solitude had shaped his years, felt something like purpose. He didn't know what the drums would bring, whether blood or redemption, but he knew they didn't beat for vengeance. They beat because someone still remembered. The hills had found their voice again, and Red Hollow would have to listen. At dawn, the sky wore a bruise of ash. Thin tendrils of smoke lifted from the distant ridge like the fingers of ghosts remembering where they died. The townsfolk stood on porches and peered through narrowed eyes, whispering half-formed fears behind mugs of coffee gone cold. Cattle were gone, vanished without a cry in the night. Fences splintered, as if clawed by something not quite man, not quite beast. One rancher found his branding iron stuck upright in the ground, the metal still warm, beside a feather braided with horsehair. The preacher called it desecration. The banker called for rifles. But Micah Dane just stood by the well with a whetstone and a quiet grin carved from old scars. He'd seen war dressed up as progress, seen vengeance hide behind uniforms and treaties. But this wasn't war. This was message. The smoke wasn't fire. It was a flare lit by memory, an invitation written in cinder. Awanita didn't speak, but she moved with intention, gathering herbs, stitching something in leather, whispering to the wind, like it could carry her words to the trees. The sheriff tried to calm nerves, tried to say it was just drifters or wolves, but no one believed him. not with the drum beats still echoing through their bones and the birds refusing to fly east. And when someone asked Micah what he thought, he looked to the ridge, then back to the town that had called him mad, and said, "If your house was taken, wouldn't you knock first?" No one answered, because deep down, even the cruelest of them knew, you don't ignore smoke when it comes from sacred ground, and you don't steal from people whose stories are older than your map. Red Hollow was no longer alone on the prairie. The ridge had spoken, and it wasn't done yet. Micah found the old miner crouched by the well, hands trembling, not from age, but memory, as if time itself had grown too heavy to carry alone. The man didn't look up when Micah approached, just stared into the water like it might swallow his guilt. "It wasn't soldiers," the miner muttered, voice raw with rust. "It was us, town men, hired guns, even the preacher's brother. Gold was found in the ravine near their sacred ground, and greed came quicker than a flood. Said it was ours by right, that they weren't using it. So we went in at night, torches and shotguns. They didn't fight. Most just ran. But the women, the girls," his voice cracked like brittle wood, "we told the story different after. Said they attacked first. Said we defended ourselves. But there ain't a man still breathing who believes it." Micah said nothing, only listened, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. "Juanita," the miner continued, "she was just a child. They thought she burned up with the rest. I saw her crawl from the ashes. She looked right at me, and I turned away." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the well's windlass, creaking with ghost weight. "I never told no one," he whispered, "because if I did, I'd have to remember her face." Micah leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Now you've remembered. What are you going to do with it?" The old man didn't answer, but his eyes welled with something other than water. Behind them, the sky dimmed as another drum beat rolled through the hills. It wasn't just a reckoning anymore. It was a return. And now the truth had a name, a witness, and a memory that wouldn't go back underground. They came at dawn, not with war cries, but with the kind of silence that carried centuries. From the ridges above Red Hollow, they appeared like ghosts made flesh, their bodies still, but their paint speaking for them. Lines of ash, bands of ochre, symbols drawn from bloodlines nearly erased. Some were boys who had once been shadows behind trees, now grown into men with eyes hard as river stones. Others were elders whose names had been scrubbed from the town's history, whose families had vanished beneath torchlight and greedy treaties. Their horses stood in perfect formation, not stampeded or charging, but patient, like judges waiting for a verdict already written. The townsfolk froze in their porches and doorways, rifles raised but unsure, because these weren't enemies in the usual sense. These were reminders of broken promises, of land stolen not just from beneath feet, but from the very soul of the earth. And at the center of it all stood Juanita, silent still, but no longer alone. Micah stepped beside her, hat in hand, weathered face calm. He saw recognition flicker in the crowd, not just fear, but memory, of fathers who'd lied, of ledgers doctored, of whispers dismissed. "It ain't a war," Micah said to no one in particular, "unless you choose to make it one." The warriors made no move to descend. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was a declaration more powerful than any rifle shot. A reckoning had come, and this time it didn't need permission. The drums were quiet now, but every heartbeat in Red Hollow thudded with the echo. What had been hidden was standing tall. What had been called myth was wearing bone and sinew. And what had been stolen was coming home, not in flames, but in unwavering stillness. Micah walked down the center of Main Street like a man with nothing left to fear, and everything left to say. The dust curled around his boots as shutters clapped closed and rifles peeked from windows, trembling slightly in calloused hands. Men who'd once called him crazy now stood in a crooked line across the square. Farmers, shopkeepers, drunks, turned deputies overnight, united by panic more than principle. Awanita stood at the far end behind him, flanked by her kin along the ridge, motionless as stone. Micah didn't slow. He reached the middle of the street, then stopped. The hush was suffocating. The wind dared not speak. Then, without a word, he unshouldered his rifle, crouched, and placed it gently on the dirt. He straightened, arms out wide, palms empty, voice steady. "You want blood, you start it right here." No one moved. Not the sheriff, not the butcher with the shotgun, not the boy shaking behind the smithy's barrel. "But I warn you," Micah continued, "once that first shot's fired, there ain't no fence tall enough, no Bible thick enough, no deed clean enough to hide behind. These people," he nodded toward the ridges, "they remember everything, and so do I." A murmur ran through the line like a broken fence in a gale. The sheriff wiped his brow with a sleeve, but said nothing. One man lowered his rifle, then another. The silence didn't break. It deepened, like soil freshly turned before a grave. Then Awanita stepped forward, her eyes burning not with vengeance, but with centuries of withheld dignity. She said nothing, yet somehow the entire town heard her. Because it wasn't just a standoff between men with guns. It was history, stopping to ask who still had the guts to do right. Micah didn't blink, neither did the mountain behind him. And Red Hollow, for the first time in a decade, stood still enough to listen. The boy couldn't have been more than 15, his braids still loose and his frame wiry with youth. But he walked with the poise of someone who'd watched too much grief to ever waste a step. He approached from the line of warriors with slow certainty, a single carved knife tucked into his belt, bone handle, obsidian blade, and 3 feathers bound near the hilt. The weapon wasn't for violence. It was a gift, an heirloom. Something passed not through blood, but through belief. Micah stood still, his hands at his sides, unsure if he was being tested or anointed. But the boy didn't speak. He simply extended the knife, eyes locked with Micah's, like someone measuring soul instead of skin. Behind him, the other warriors made no move. This was not their moment. It belonged to the boy, to the one who would someday lead. Awanita stepped up beside Micah, her hand light on his chest, her touch the only anchor, in a world that suddenly felt like it was shifting under his boots. He took the blade slowly, reverently, and when his fingers closed around the hilt, it felt less like a weapon and more like a key, one that unlocked something deep in the marrow, where guilt had once burrowed like rot. The boy nodded, turned, and returned to the ridge. No ceremony, no words. Just a gesture older than treaties, and twice as binding. Micah didn't speak either. He couldn't. The weight in his chest wasn't pain, it was purpose. Awanita's eyes shimmered in the dusk, not from tears, but recognition. She saw what no one in Red Hollow had ever tried to see. A man not just defending her, but belonging beside her, not as a savior, not as a soldier, as something quieter and far more enduring, a witness who stayed, a soul who listened. And in that single silent offering, between feather and flint, Micah Dane ceased being the town's madman and became something rarer, a bridge built by bravery and earned by blood that was never spilled. As the dust settled and the air thickened with silence, one by one the rifles dropped, some with shame, others with quiet relief. The townsfolk of Red Hollow, faces drawn and pale in the morning light, stood like a congregation at a funeral they finally realized they'd caused. The preacher, who once thumped his chest with fire and brimstone sermons about God's order and white dominion, vanished before noon, his church doors swinging open like a broken jaw left unhinged. The sheriff, a man who once pinned law to his chest like armor, stepped down without a word, his badge left sitting in the dirt like a coin returned to fate. No one clapped, no one cheered. Because reckoning doesn't come with parades. It comes with ledgers and graves and the long, aching drag of undoing what never should have been done. Reparations didn't start with apologies. They began with action. Plots of land returned with trembling hands. Tools given, not as charity, but as restitution. Birth records once buried deep in courthouse basements were dug up, dusted off, and delivered to families who hadn't dared speak their ancestors' names aloud in decades. Awanita stood at the edge of it all, not demanding vengeance, but watching it unfold, her presence more powerful than any raised voice. And Micah, weathered, scarred, still unsure what redemption really looked like, stood beside her, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a man who once stood alone and now stood with. Children peeked from behind skirts and saloon doors, their eyes filled with something new, not fear, not hate, but wonder. The drums no longer echoed from the hills. They were in the hearts of those who had once turned away, now listening. Red Hollow didn't burn. It didn't fall. It changed, slowly, like frost melting from old wood, revealing the grain beneath. A town doesn't surrender all at once. It lets go, piece by piece. And in that surrender, sometimes, it finds something worth holding on to. Micah never left Red Hollow, not because he was needed, but because for the first time in his long, battered life, he wanted to stay. He took to mending fences, not just of wood, but of trust, his rough hands working side by side with those who once called him mad. Awanita, graceful as wind through pine, became more than just a teacher. She became a keeper of memory, guiding children through stories their parents were too afraid or ashamed to tell. The little ones, once shadows pressed to their mother's skirts, now ran wild through the trees with laughter that bounced like birdsong off the rocks. Paint returned to faces, songs to gatherings, and the land, scarred but still sacred, began to breathe again. Every morning, Micah would rise with the sun and listen. Some days, the wind still carried the echo of those drums that once rolled like thunder through the hills, a low hum reminding him of the line he dared to cross and the peace it helped forge. But over time, that sound softened. It wasn't absence, it was rest. The hills, like the people, had said what they needed to say. And now, in place of war songs, there were lullabies. In place of warning fires, cooking fires. And Micah, once an outcast with only silence and ghosts for company, now sat beneath the same old oak, each evening with Awanita beside him, and children at his feet, listening, not for the next fight, but for the quiet that comes after a storm finally passes. The last drumbeat didn't mean the end. It meant healing had begun.